First of all, welcome to all. My name is Mia Mikic. I am the advisor at large for ARTNeT, and I'm very happy to be back here hosting this very important topic. Now, just some preliminary matters that we always go through in the online webinars. For your information, the webinar is being recorded, and the video of the webinar will be placed in the dedicated web page for the event. Now, this of course, means that while you are staying with us as an attendee, you are actually giving us your implicit permission to record and disseminate the material as we see fit. So in terms of the structure of the webinar, we will be first hearing from our speakers, and then we will open the floor for the discussion with the participants and between the speakers, myself, and participants. So you are welcome to post your questions in the chat column from now on, and we will be trying to respond to as many questions as possible, as time is always short for these type of events. Let me go straight into the content of the session. The webinar was motivated by some very encouraging positive changes in the woman trade nexus. As noted in the flyer that we have shared announcing the webinar, trade and trade policy used to be labeled as gender blind or sometimes as gender neutral. And now increasingly we see changes that signal that trade is made and trade policy is gender responsive. One of the key factors contributing to this positive transformation or awakening is capacity of researchers to provide evidence about gender differentiated impacts of trade and trade policy changes, including those incorporated in the free trade agreements. And this is actually the topic of our session. But before we go into it, I have to say that unfortunately, not all recent developments bring positive changes. And I would like to express support for all the women whose human rights are being eroded or taken away, including those in Ukraine, Afghanistan, United States, and so many other places. In our small way, in our ARTNeT community, we see this support to women being in enhancing understanding on how to design trade and trade-related policies with better impact, especially for women. The session therefore includes two leading initiatives developed to increase quality of research and their findings, and thus contributing to better, meaning more effective, policies towards women's economic empowerment through trade. These two initiatives have been developed and heralded by our two speakers today. So we are honored and privileged to have with us Ms. Georgina Wainwright-Kemderin and Ms. Jane Korinek from OECD. Ms. Georgina Wainwright-Kemderin is the senior official at Global Affairs Canada. She is, of course, very well known for developing this unique Canadian approach for applying a comprehensive gender-based analysis plus to trade negotiations and to the final form of the agreements. She serves as lead negotiator of Canada's inclusive trade chapters in trade agreements, including trade and gender, and she leads on the implementation of those enforced chapters. She is also Canada's gender focal point for trade policy and negotiations. And we welcome back Jane Korinek. She is, of course, known to us from the previous webinars. She is an economist and trade policy analyst in the Trade and Agriculture Directorate of the OECD, and her recent policy research has examined how trade impacts women and men differently, and how trade policies can support women's economic empowerment. She is presently researching how trade impacts women in New Zealand in a joint project with the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And we are joined today by my co-moderator, Ms. Vanika Sharma. She will be helping curating the questions from the participants. She is, in her own words, described as interested in international economics and policy and result-oriented and headstrong. I would say that she is very intelligent and very hardworking, and she has been working for many institutions, ITC, UNCTAD, ESCAP, SIPE, and also she has been writing very interesting pieces of work, including with myself. Well, with this out of our way, let me jump right into the more interesting part than my introductory remarks. And so I will ask Georgina to go to her presentation and share presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mia, and thank you for the very nice introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone across Asia and beyond. I'm speaking to you from Ottawa, Canada today. So I do have a presentation. Let's hope this works. I think I click that, and then I click. Are you seeing my presentation there? Yes? Okay. I'm going to put it on slideshow mode. Is that going to go? There it is. So that looks good? Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to be telling you a little bit about Canada's approach to conducting gender-based analysis of trade negotiations as indicated by Mia. So thank you so much, Mia, for the opportunity to present today. So I'm going to first of all tell you what is gender-based analysis plus. So Canada, this is an assessment process that we use to consider how diverse groups of women and men experience policies, programs, and initiatives. And I have to say that this is something that applies to all the work of the Government of Canada, not just trade policy. So it was mandated back in 2015 by our new Prime Minister at the time, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, that all policies that are being considered for development or renewal must undergo a gender-based analysis plus. GBA plus. And the plus, that is really, interesting too, because that goes beyond the biological and sociocultural considerations to consider overlapping identity factors, or intersectionality, as some people call it. And if you look at that flower on the right there, that's what we're trying to get at here. Considerations around race, for example, or sexual orientation, or age, or disability. In Canada, we also look at indigeneity, Indigenous groups, and also, where people live, because we're such a large country. So we like to also consider, well, if it's a Black woman living in an urban setting, or an Indigenous woman living in the far north, how will they receive a policy? So it does put people at the heart of decision making, and it seeks to ensure that we do not perpetuate or exacerbate inequalities or inequities. And really, GBA Plus is changing the way we do trade policy. And it's very central to us delivering on our inclusive approach to trade. As you see there, GBA Plus is at the center of those three bubbles of work that we are undertaking as we're advancing our inclusive approach to trade. And this approach really aims to recognize that trade policies must contribute more meaningfully to broader economic, social, and environmental policy priorities. And it seeks to ensure that the benefits of trade are more widely shared, including with traditionally underrepresented groups in trade, such as women and Indigenous peoples. And this approach is very consistent with Canada's feminist foreign policy and other policies and strategies noted there. So our approach, aims to advance informed and inclusive trade policy making, seeking inclusive trade provisions and chapters in trade agreements, and also advancing international engagement, including with the OECD. So I do know Jane's work very well. So as I said, informing our approach is very, very important. We collect extensive gender disaggregated data and analyze it very carefully. We conduct extensive engagement and consultations with underrepresented groups, such as with our Gender and Trade Advisory Group and our Indigenous Working Group on Trade Policy. And all this feeds into GBA Plus, and this is very central to our approach. So Canada's approach on conducting GBA Plus is built really on two prongs of work. One is our quantitative analysis, which is led by the Office of the Chief Economist at Global Affairs Canada, using data that is collected by our national statistical agency, Statistics Canada. And they use this data to conduct an expanded economic impact assessment and a labor market module overlaid, and using an expanded traditional CGE model. And then there's our qualitative approach, which takes all the economic analysis and modeling and data, and we feed that into our assessment of our ongoing and model trade chapters. And this work is led by our trade negotiators, and we bring the findings forward in real time during negotiations. Just a little bit more about the quantitative approach and the economic impact assessment. What I find really unique and amazing, I mean, I'm not an economist, but I was really amazed by the work of our Office of the Chief Economist. This expanded labor market module that they are now using to conduct our impact assessments takes into account gender, age, and the distribution of Canadian workers across 8 different occupational groups and 65 sectors of the economy. So I was just blown away by this because I didn't even know we had 65 sectors of the economy. So it aims to assess the potential impact on our economy in 2040, following the full implementation of a possible agreement and with the assumption of full liberalization. And as I've noted, they use various data sources, primarily from Statistics Canada. Now, on the qualitative side, the second prong of our approach here, as I mentioned, our lead negotiators for each chapter in a trade agreement do conduct this analysis. And these days, trade agreements can contain 25 to 35, 40 chapters. So we do a GBA on each chapter. So you can imagine this is quite an extensive document. Once we have it all compiled together, and they integrate the economic findings. And what we ask them to do is consider the effects in Canada of each chapter's provisions on men and women in the economy in their various roles as workers, business owners and entrepreneurs, producers and consumers wherever possible. Consumers can be a challenge sometimes. And also consider, the roles of these people in various sectors of the economy as well. And then we also ask them to consider where there's data and other evidence, the effects on Indigenous people. Of course, women and Indigenous people are top priorities, but also other groups of people. Canada's a very diverse country, and these regional considerations that I've already mentioned. And then we also ask them to look at various key effects, direct effects and indirect effects, positive and negative, intended and unintended. And really, the unintended effects are probably the most difficult to sort of get at, but it's where the most value can be extracted from all of this research and analysis. If we can understand the unintended effects of provisions in a chapter, then we can really start to understand the effects in the economy of a chapter that may not have really been identified previously, and then aim to address them with new trade policy provisions in a chapter. But at the same time, as you see here, we have to recognize that trade policy sometimes does not have the solution to findings that emerge from this process. So I've just listed here some questions that we do ask our lead negotiators to consider when they're conducting their analysis. I've been through most of them, and you can look at these later. But there is this standard step-by-step process for conducting GBA that we've brought forward into the trade policy process as well. And of course, identifying issues, challenging assumptions, gathering facts and evidence, conducting research, developing options and strategies for addressing findings. These are all really key steps. But really, I think one of the most important ones is moving beyond common assumptions. And in her introduction, Mia did mention some of those assumptions, such as gender being trade neutral. We know this is not the case, and it's really important to be able to sort of get beyond a traditional assumption like that, or an assumption that my policy or program benefits everyone equally, or everyone has access, or there's no gender barriers here. Once you dig into things, you find that there are a lot of challenges there for women and others in benefiting from trade or accessing opportunities and programs and services. So, Canada's been doing this GBA plus of our trade agreements now for almost 4 years. And we have, learned a lot in this process. And I would say that we're still learning a lot and have more to learn too. I wouldn't say that we're experts in this. It's an evolving skill, but we have been able to identify the value of conducting GBA plus, and as Mia mentioned, what is this all about? But why is it important, and what are we learning as we are doing this? So the benefits of conducting GBA plus, certainly it recognizes that trade is not gender neutral, and GBA plus is essential to delivering on our inclusive approach to trade, as I've mentioned. So it's really helping us mainstream gender provisions across the full trade agreement. And we're hoping to achieve gender responsive and transformative trade agreements. Canada, as some may know, we are advancing trade and gender chapters in our trade agreements, but we're also mainstreaming gender across our full trade agreements, supported by this GBA plus approach. So we really want to distribute the benefits of trade more widely. GBA Plus is helping us understand the impacts and effects of trade agreements more clearly across our economy and across different population groups. It's supporting continuous strengthening and innovating of our trade chapters, because once you dig into the chapter and understand the effects, and you're trying to come up with solutions to address negative findings or positive opportunities, it's inspiring innovation, and new provisions are emerging. So yeah, and I think what's unique about our approach too is that because we do this continually throughout a trade negotiation, we are able to develop new provisions and table them in real time at the negotiating table with our trade partners. And we're also working with our trade partners to let them know what we're doing in Canada on GBA plus, and what we're finding, what we're learning, and why we are tabling this provision. And and maybe this is inspiring our trade partners to do similar research and analysis on their side to understand the benefits and challenges that women in their economies might face in benefiting and participating in trade. So certainly GBA Plus is demonstrating the value of mainstreaming gender across trade agreements as well. We know that as we're doing this, trade and gender chapters are not sufficient for ensuring that women can benefit from trade. We know that, so far trade and gender chapters typically are not enforceable in trade agreements, although we always seek that in Canada's strategy. But, gender provisions in other chapters typically are enforceable. We are also signaling by doing this work that trade is not gender neutral, and gender is relevant in every chapter and in every element of a trade agreement, whether it's technical barriers to trade, services trade, investment, intellectual property, sanitary, phytosanitary measures. Trade and gender is relevant in all of these chapters, and I think this is important messaging for trade negotiators. I think our work is also demonstrating the importance of policy coherence across, trade policy, but also domestic policy, and really seeking a whole of government approach on trade and gender. Yeah, and I'm finding also that this work is inspiring action and understanding by the business sector as well. Many benefits of this work. And, as I've said, there are a lot of strengths in Canada's approach as well, but we are continuing to learn and modify our approach as we learn more. But as I've mentioned, it includes both quantitative and qualitative dimensions. It's led by our lead negotiators who know their chapters very well. It's adaptable to different scenarios in a trade negotiation, whether it's a new trade negotiation, a modernization, or accession. We're currently involved in the accession of various economies who want to join the CPTPP. So we're doing GBA on this work and other areas as I've mentioned here. It is iterative, it's value added, it's flexible. This early and ongoing analysis I think is really important and inspires continual improvement and innovation. So there are challenges though, and I often say that GBA Plus is a disruptor. Some trade negotiators and others, are challenged to sort of think beyond what they've always done, and to think outside of the box, and challenge the way things have always been done. So, but this disruptor aspect, this thinking outside of the box, does inspire innovation, as I've said, and it can allow us to develop new trade policy provisions or set aside ones that don't work anymore. But one of the other challenges is just overcoming resistance to doing things differently, and there's examples of some of this. Certainly, a lack of adequate gender disaggregated data can be a challenge, but it shouldn't be an excuse for not, trying to do some of this work and getting data and evidence in other ways. Let's see. Also, some see the application of gender-based analysis as a zero-sum game. That if that men will lose if women can gain more access to opportunities and benefits, and we don't believe in that at all on the Canada side of things. Yeah, let's see here. And success factors. So certainly, as we've advanced our approach, we have realized that there are certainly some important aspects to have in place to ensure that we can do GBA plus of our trade agreements. Certainly, the gender disaggregated data is important. The willingness to move beyond common assumptions, capacity to interpret data, capacity to develop and implement economic modeling. But one thing that I think is very important and can be almost an oversight is to have government ministries that consult with each other. At Global Affairs Canada, we work very closely with our Women and Gender Equality Ministry, our Indigenous Affairs Ministries, and other ministries across the government, so we can benefit from what they know and what they're learning and what they're doing, and also we can discuss our findings with them in our own analysis. Certainly, to support lead negotiators, it takes a lot of training and guidance and work with them, so they can do this deep analysis on their chapters and bring forward new provisions and strategies for ensuring that women and other groups in Canada are not negatively affected by our trade negotiations and trade agreements when they come to be implemented. And we do have a very comprehensive system and structure within global affairs to advance this work. So tips for doing good GBA plus, I think it's really important to start early. We try and start very early doing GBA plus. We know that GBA plus applies at each stage of the trade policy development cycle, and that's sort of listed a little bit more thoroughly in the last bullet point on this slide. It's iterative, evergreen. We want people to keep an open mind and be always open to updating, renewing, bringing new research and new findings into the analysis. We really want to try and advance gender equality outcomes for women through a trade agreement and moving beyond traditional approaches. So some key messages I would leave you with is that certainly in the case of Canada, GBA Plus is changing the way we do trade policy. GBA Plus is not just about women, but it's about all people and putting people and their lived experience at the heart of our public policy development, including trade policy. It's a disruptor and policy innovation tool, as I've mentioned. And I think it's safe to say that nothing is ever gender neutral. There's at least an opportunity to do more to try to drive positive change. I'm just leaving you, and I know we are going to be sending out these PowerPoints later, but we also have a trade policy gender pledge that we established back on International Women's Day 2019, and you can review this, and this is what guides our work on an ongoing basis as trade negotiators for the Government of Canada. Yeah, so that's the end of my presentation for now, and I'm happy to take questions later. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane. I think you already received one question in the chat, so maybe you can have a look at that one while we listen through Jane's presentation. And I certainly noted down at least 3 or 4 questions that sort of I'm interested in asking you about, but I'm sure others will join me as well. So Jane, please, we would, yes, thank you. You just need to raise it to the presentation level if possible. Fantastic. Floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Mia, and thanks for the invitation. Alongside to give a little overview of some of the work we've been doing in this area, alongside the very interesting work done by Canada. So I'd like to present the OECD's framework of analysis of trade and gender, where we aim to measure impacts of trade on women, impacts of trade and trade policy on women at the country level. And so we've developed this framework of analysis, and all of this information is publicly available. It's mostly contained in an OECD trade policy paper called Trade and Gender, a Framework of Analysis, which is publicly available. So we start by analyzing the impacts of trade and trade policy on women in 3 of their economic roles: as workers, as consumers, and as entrepreneurs and business leaders. And from that analysis, we developed a framework by which this can be analyzed at the country level. And we have, at the more granular understanding of how trade and trade policy impacts women and men differently, and that governments can undertake themselves or with the OECD. And we have actually just completed our first trade and gender review of New Zealand, jointly with the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So I'd like to give you a little sense of the framework itself, and I'll give you some examples of how we applied that in New Zealand. So first of all, we assessed the impacts of trade on women workers, and so, labor force participation, to what extent they engage in trade in their jobs, and also the wages that they earn in export-oriented jobs compared with those that are not export-oriented. Our framework includes the potential also to look at other job characteristics like security of employment in the case that that data is available. And if we take a little look at some of the information that we found in New Zealand, we compared women and men in terms of their export orientation, and found that in most sectors, men are more engaged in export than women. This is a finding that we have found throughout a lot of OECD countries. And we took a little bit of a closer look at some of those sectors for New Zealand. We also know that trade-related jobs pay better. That is true for women and for men. There is an export pay premium for jobs that are trade-related, that are engaged directly in export, as compared with those jobs that produce goods and services that are destined for the domestic market. However, we do find that women benefit less from this export pay premium, because the gender wage gaps in the tradable sectors are higher than those in the non-tradable sectors. So that means that women benefit slightly less from one of these main gains from trade, that is producing higher paying jobs. This is the case in New Zealand, but some other related research has shown similar findings in, for example, some of the Scandinavian countries. A second aspect of our quantitative analysis looks at barriers that women face to trading, but also to engaging in the labor force and growing their businesses. And these are generally non-trade related barriers, but we do look at these to the extent that the data is available and that we can. And some of those barriers are, for example, women's engagement in unpaid work in the home. So we know that in every country of the world, women are responsible for more hours spent on domestic chores, childcare, and caring for elders. So we look at that and we see how that has changed over time, if possible, and the gaps between unpaid work undertaken by women and unpaid work undertaken by men. Another barrier that we assess in our framework is access to credit and access to equity, which underscores, this barrier to access to finance that many women entrepreneurs face. Another aspect that we have looked at is women-owned businesses. We find that women-owned businesses are generally smaller than those owned by men, and they are less well-financed. And so, in fact, there is an overlap between the policies that support women entrepreneurs and policies that support micro and small enterprises. And those policies are, one of the main ones, for example, is trade facilitation reforms. Facilitating trade, because trade is risky and trade is the barriers to trade that exist and large trade costs that exist in some countries in crossing borders. They affect micro and small enterprises much more than they do large enterprises, because micro and small enterprises have less resources to engage in trade and to work through any cumbersome border procedures. And the last aspect of the quantitative part of our framework of analysis looks at impacts on consumers. As Georgina mentioned, it is difficult to look at impacts on women consumers as a whole because generally consumption data is undertaken at the household level. So the way we have decided to look into that is assess the price effects of trade and trade barriers on different types of households. So we know that trade lowers consumer prices in general. What we have found is that more vulnerable households, such as households with single-parent households with dependent children, which are in their majority headed by women, more vulnerable households are more strongly impacted by lower consumer prices through trade. And so lowering trade barriers will benefit even more vulnerable households and those in lower income categories. And we measured for New Zealand, in the New Zealand study, exactly how much those trade barriers cost to different types of households and different types of consumers. Our framework of analysis also looks in quite a bit of detail at a number of policy settings. First of all, looking at the trade restrictiveness in services sectors, because we know that's where women work most. And so measuring the restrictiveness in services trade measures the difficulty which women-owned businesses working in services, for example, will have in exporting what they produce. We also look in quite a level of detail at the level of trade facilitation reforms, because we know these are important to women-owned businesses that are also generally micro and small businesses. And we take a very comprehensive look at the gender provisions in existing trade agreements. And I'll explain in a minute, why we do that. But first, so this graph shows you the comparison of the trade facilitation state of play in New Zealand, here shown as the blue lines, compared with some other small open economies. New Zealand is a country where it is the trade facilitation reforms have been by and large undertaken, and so we do look at this in quite a level of detail in order to make policy recommendations as to how New Zealand can do even better than they have thus far in terms of trade, facilitating trade for small and medium enterprises. We also use a qualitative approach in our framework of analysis, and that is mostly structured interviews with women entrepreneurs, so as to better understand the challenges they face to exporting, also to better understand how they engage with professional networks. Networks are an area where we know this poses challenges to women entrepreneurs and women business leaders. They seem to get less out of professional networks that exist. In one of the pieces of research, not done by OECD, but done by other organizations, they refer to old boys networks, where women are less engaged and that they seem to get less out of such networks. So we look into this question of professional networks. And we also have looked into the export promotion agencies. So what are the policies of these agencies that exist in many OECD countries that support exporters, and how inclusive they are of women entrepreneurs and women business leaders. And so in our pilot review of New Zealand, we have done all of this analysis to better understand how New Zealand women are impacted by trade and what the challenges are to them engaging in trade and growing their businesses overseas. And New Zealand has taken a whole of government approach. So we have been engaging not only with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, but also with customs, with export promotion agencies, with the Ministry of Women. And we have been suggesting a whole host of policy recommendations. And the main areas of policy recommendations are shown here. The aim, of course, is to strengthen New Zealand's policy mix to support its women. And so there are a number of ways in which to do that. We made recommendations of provisions, gender-related provisions, to be included in future trade agreements or modernization of trade agreements. We also made one of the main suggestions in this area was to undertake gender differentiated ex ante impact analyses, similar to the ones explained by the previous speaker that are undertaken in Canada, in order to better understand during the negotiating process how women and men will be impacted differently by any market access that is obtained. And these results then can influence negotiating priorities so that gender gaps are not widened, but rather are reduced thanks to the trade agreement. Another area where we make some policy recommendations is communication of the benefits of trade and trade agreements. Many small business owners do not understand how they can take advantage of some of the trade agreements that have been negotiated. This is not true only in New Zealand. This is true in most countries. And so communicating the benefits of trade agreements and how small business owners can take advantage of those is another aspect that we consider to be fairly important. There are a lot of recommendations in the area of trade facilitation, as that is one main area that impacts micro and small enterprises. We talk also about ensuring the representation of women, not only in trade policymaking and in trade negotiations, but also as countries engage with stakeholders, that they ensure that women's professional organizations are weighing in on policy options and discussions before policy and negotiations are undertaken. Another important area is trade promotion and ensuring that export promotion programs are intentional, intentionally inclusive. And one step is to start by collecting gender differentiated statistics on who exactly is taking advantage of trade promotion initiatives. And there are other areas that we look into, data gaps, for example. One of the, I would say, the main gains from this trade and gender review of New Zealand has been to combine data sources that were not previously used, and in order to undertake this gender differentiated analysis. These are not new statistics, but they are new ways of combining statistics that have given us this much more nuanced picture of who is benefiting from trade. And of course, as Georgina mentioned also, trade is not the whole story. We also look into main areas of domestic policies that increase the challenges to women to engage in trade. And we are planning to extend this work to include other countries, and this way contribute to the knowledge base in this area through a deep dive into the impacts of trade on women at the country level, and suggesting policy reforms to make trade and relevant domestic policies more inclusive at the country level and more gender sensitive. Thank you.
Of course, I need to unmute myself. Thank you very much, Jane, for this fantastic presentation. And to the participants, we will be posting both presentations online as soon as possible. I know you are keen to get your hands on all the details that are contained in these presentations. So I think I need to remind participants that they are welcome to post the questions in the chat box. We are a relatively small group, so if you have a very well formed phrased question, you may raise your hand if you wish, and we can call upon you later. But let me start a discussion, because both Georgina and Jane have opened so many issues, and I would want to start with this notion about the necessity to have the whole of the government approach involved in pursuing gender-based analysis and gender impact and the sort of a woman's economic empowerment through trade. And here I want to be a little bit controversial and ask the following question. So typically we expect that trade agreement will sort of protect domestic sectors, and so we try to sort of negotiate and exchange commercial interests between domestic, say, steel industry and foreign some other sector, right? That's the job of negotiators. But in a context of improving a woman's position through trade in a general way, do we sort of care about how our policy or our trade provisions will impact the woman in our trading partner? And do we go to the extent as such that, for example, in US MCA, where they were looking at imposing certain standards in order to protect labor in one trading partner from perhaps possible exploitation through the reduction of wages for pursuing competitiveness. So how do we deal with this notion of wanting to really improve women and not keeping it to the woman of the national entity, but women across the trading partners that we deal with? Both of you, whoever wants to take it first.
Okay, I could jump in. So I mean, that is a difficult question, and I think we are still figuring that out. I mean, as I mentioned in my presentation, Canada is just starting off this work in terms of bringing that GBA plus lens to our chapters and our analysis and our trade negotiations, and we are in the first instance looking at the effects in Canada on women as workers and business owners and consumers. But of course, we don't lose sight of the potential for inclusive trade and GBA to have a positive effect on our trade negotiating partner. That's why we try to explain to them why Canada's doing what we're doing. We know that going forward at some point, and maybe sooner than later, we're going to have to start to think a little bit more about that dimension, you know, the effects on women and other underrepresented groups in our trade partner. But a key aspect of that is we want to work with our trade partner on that. We need to work with them and understand their data and you know, and what that means to them. But we haven't really done that yet. And we know that's a gap, but we also know that is sort of where we need to be going in the spirit of the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, and ensuring that all can benefit, and that, you know, it's not just Canadians who can benefit, but all can benefit, because we know that, you know, trade and globalization has been perceived to be negative in some places, and you know, we do not believe that in Canada. I mean, particularly for Canada, we're such a small country in population size, but we have a disproportionate dependence on trade and engagement in trade globally. So we feel very concerned for this, and we also know that our inclusive approach to trade can have development dividends for countries who want to work with Canada in this area and do inclusive trade and share and do cooperation activities, and really work to show that women's participation in the economy and in trade has economic developments and benefits and development benefits to the other country. So this, we hope, will inspire their engagement. But there's still work to do, and we're very conscious of that in Canada for sure.
Thank you. Jane, your comment?
Sure, if I can just add to that, I would say there are a number of ways that that trade agreements can benefit women in, you know, in both partner countries or in all partner countries. One of the main ways that gender provisions are included in trade agreements is through kind of giving support to existing labor standards. So existing ILO conventions on non-discrimination, for example, or equality between men and women, or the CEDAW Convention against discrimination against women. And you know, so those are ways in which, you know, monitoring mechanisms for these types of conventions can be supported by, you know, monitoring mechanisms undertaken within the context of a trade agreement. In our suggestions to New Zealand, we suggested that in the case that New Zealand undertakes a trade agreement with a country that is, for example, at a very different level of development, and that may not undertake such impact assessments of the trade agreement, that it would be in the general interest to collaborate on that, and that, you know, the more developed country would work with the developing country partner on better understanding impacts in both countries. And I would say outside the, you know, terrain of trade agreement negotiation, we also have a number of areas in terms of aid for trade where, you know, countries can engage with each other in order to support women entrepreneurs and women-owned businesses in, for example, an aid recipient country. OECD is actually working right now with the WTO on a project specifically on this aspect.
Thank you. This is, I mean, it's a wonderful news from both of you, hearing that actually thinking is there on how to expand this sort of approach of this having to be win-win in the end. Otherwise, it's not going to be a long-term sort of improvement in the context of inclusive and sustainable development. And definitely, if it's wrapped under the aid for trade component as well, in addition to the concrete sort of negotiating efforts, it may actually have it may have a life on its own, extended in developing capacity of the countries that perhaps are not as nuanced at present to take interest in how to promote women's economic empowerment through trade agreements and to do so. But let me quickly go to another question, again, a little bit controversy, before I give floor to Vanika. So again, to both of you, very often I come across criticism that by pushing for inclusion of provisions in trade agreements that would embolden these countries to sort of put in place binding provisions, is taking away the strength of the instrument of trade agreement, which is to increase the efficiency of the economy and do not worry about the distributional effects of such. So they then go a bit further and say that there is no place of putting a sort of international rules in WTO context that would allow countries to go even to the dispute settlement in case of breach of such provisions that need to protect women's economic empowerment. Based on your experience in both analytical and sort of work with negotiators and policymakers, etc., and other set of representatives, what is your take on such argument? Efficiency versus distribution, and how far do we have can we take it into rulemaking area?
I can jump in on that as well. So what I've been talking about so far here right now is Canada's inclusive approach to trade, and this is our sort of new approach to trade policy, and that is about considering the distributional effects of trade. So it's our new approach. It's only been around for 4 or 5 years, I would say. And, we are very cognizant of the importance of sharing more widely the benefits of trade and, creating more opportunities to participate in trade, as workers, business owners, entrepreneurs, and providing supports to that end, like not only, like trade policy provisions to sort of, present these opportunities, but also at the domestic level, having support programs, flanking policies to ensure that the opportunities created by trade agreements can be leveraged and taken advantage of by women-owned businesses or women workers or others in the economy. So I would say that we're doing both. And, there was a question in the chat there about experimental research being done by Canada in this area. I mean, everything that Jane has spoken about at the OECD, I mean, we are complete supporters and believers in and are doing our own research in this area and have been for a number of years. Our National Statistical Agency is really, has this new gender and diversity portal and hub, and is actively collecting data across our economy on a wide range of variables and indicators around distributional effects in the economy and in trade. So we're very advanced in this area, and our chief economist's office does do deep dive research on women-owned businesses, women exporters, and what sectors, what's their income, who do they hire, is there there seems to be a lower wage gap when you have a women-owned business, and they tend to hire more diverse employees and certainly more women employees, and allow for greater movement up the management chain. So that we do a lot of deep dive research and experimental research. I mean, this is not me, but I take that and bring it into the GBA and make sure my colleagues are aware of this and how we can sort of further advance this work in our trade agreements. So I would say that this just distributional effect is very important for us. I mean, certainly the efficiency, the comparative advantages, this still features in our negotiations, but we are moving beyond these traditional approaches because we really want to ensure that, everyone can see and know that they are benefiting from trade, because as I've mentioned, like 65% of our GDP is dependent on trade in Canada, and this is huge. So we have to take this very seriously. Thank you.
Georgina, before I turn to Jane, I just want, and connecting to this, you mentioned you have been doing this for 4 or 5 years, and you have done some quantitative analysis, etc. Can you give us some examples of, you mentioned unintended effects of the trade provisions, and that you came across, and that you think others should be aware of?
Sure, I can sort of think about that for a minute. Again, much of what Jane has said, we're very cognizant of in Canada. Like, for example, if there's a trade provision in one of our chapters that will cause, a loss of significant employment for men in a manufacturing industry in one of our very industrialized zones in Canada, we will aim to take steps either within the trade agreement context to sort of modify that provision so the effects will be less, or we can transition more slowly. This is something we also do with our trade partners. If there's a particular sector that the economy of the trade partner is very dependent on in terms of duties, we can transition more slowly to lowering tariffs, like instead of like an immediate or 5-year, give 20 years, like something like this is something that we can do. But so if there's going to be a large unemployment effect or job loss effect, then we will try to modify that in the trade provision, or bring a flanking policy forward, to provide supports for retraining or to for these people. But I think the point I'm trying to flag here too, I mean, we care about men too. It's not just about women. It's about everyone in the economy. So yes, there might be a higher propensity for men to be employed in the auto industry in southwestern Ontario, for example, a province in Canada. And if there's going to be significant unemployment, we will seek to address that in trade negotiations to the greatest extent possible. And then if we don't get quite what we want, because there's a balance of outcomes, there's trade-offs, these things happen in a negotiation. We don't always get everything we want. So then we have to sort of step in, from the government side of things, and develop other support programs to address those outcomes.
So it is really, the whole thing is, as I see it from what you are saying, is having much more hands-on approach in terms of management of liberalization, right? And understanding ahead of things changed in the real economy, of what possible effects we will have, so that we can preempt them by sort of choosing complementary policies and measures in order to sort of minimize the adverse effects, etc. Some will call that managed trade in a different context, but let's not go into that.
Yeah,
into that
I wouldn't
area.
say it's managed trade. It's managing the effects of trade.
Of trade.
Yes. No, not managed trade.
Right, exactly. Right. Jane, jump in, please.
Yes, please. So your original question was one of efficiency versus distributional impacts. And I think that's a key question, because that comes up quite a bit in terms of, the pushback to some of these newer areas of research. And I would argue that they're complementary. So there's this finding by McKinsey, that some X billion dollars would be added to global GDP if women participated in the labor market to the same extent as men, something like 25% in global GDP over 10 years. So we know, and we have seen over decades of research, that trade is not a zero-sum game. That if a woman-owned business increases their trade, that's not somehow removed from a men-owned business. That adds to a gain in efficiency. I think the business case for supporting women entrepreneurs and women in trade has been made, but for some reason, policies are still lacking behind. It's a little bit similar to this question of women on boards. The case for greater diversity in management has been made for decades, and yet clearly there's some reticence to change. So I can't really say too much more than that. Just also this idea that Georgina raised, that everyone can see and know the benefits of trade. There has been a lot of pushback in many countries, in many OECD countries, to greater trade liberalization. And if people do not see the benefits of trade and assume that only one type of demographic is benefiting, obviously, there's going to be a lot less support for trade going forward. And just one more aspect of your original question, which had to do with dispute settlement. Many of the provisions, gender-related provisions, are not subject to dispute settlement, although increasingly some of the labor provisions are. I think there are reasons for that. A lot of the provisions that have been included in trade agreements thus far that are related to gender are cooperation, have to do with cooperation, or kind of more like information gathering. And obviously these are not appropriate to have subject to dispute settlement. But I think as we have more provisions that are more specifically related to labor standards, and we have seen a few of them, in particular, I believe in Canada, US, Mexico, where some of the labor provisions are subject to dispute settlement. So that is a great move forward as well.
Yeah, so that could be one way forward in promotion of women's economic empowerment through trade provisions. Vanika, let me we have very little time left, but let me bring you in and see whether you have collected any interesting questions from the participants.
First of all, thank you both of you for the very interesting presentation. I think there was just one question in the chat to Georgina, which I think you briefly answered about experimental research. Apart from that, I also had a few questions. I think one is for Jane and one is for Georgina, but please feel free to jump in. The first one is that, Jane, you mentioned in your presentation that you looked at trade and services, specifically because a lot of women traders and women-owned businesses are involved in trade and services sector. And I was wondering that with the introduction of so many digital technologies and the servicification of the economy, do you think women would be disproportionately affected? And if so, would the effects be positive or negative? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's a good one and a complex question. Indeed, women work and lead businesses in services more in their vast majority. And services are generally less traded than goods. So if we assume that greater digitalization and more trade in some of these less traded services, like, for example, health and education, where women are, predominate, we can imagine that there would be more demand for, service sector jobs. And so that would benefit women. However, when we're talking about digitalization, one of the very dynamic areas of trade and, in the economy in general is, engineering and information technologies and new technologies, which require higher education in STEM studies, right? Science, technology, engineering, and math. And we know in the OECD, women and girls study science, technology, engineering, and math at a much lower rate than boys and men. And in fact, some very recent OECD research that will be published later this year suggests that that has not changed. Despite a lot of programs in some OECD countries that aim to bring more women into STEM studies, there has been very little uptake. So that's not a very encouraging answer in terms of that. That, I should say, though, is less of an issue in some Asian countries like India and Indonesia, where women study science, technology, engineering to a much greater proportion than as compared with OECD countries.
Thanks. And for Georgina, I just had a question on the GBA Plus. And I think the GBA Plus in trade policy, I guess one of the main aims of the policy would be to get more women exporters in the country. And I was wondering, compared to domestic incentive versus trade policy, how effective would each of them be? And I guess in a broader sense, it's also how effective is trade policy in general compared to domestic policy in women's economic empowerment? Is there, how much space is there for women's economic empowerment in trade policy? How deep can it go?
Thank you, Vanika. So I would say that, these policies have to work together, the trade policy and the domestic policies. And I think here in Canada, I think we do have a very coherent and holistic approach. I mean, certainly, we are advancing trade policy, with our GBA, with our trade and gender chapters, and mainstreaming gender provisions in all chapters, and including so they can be enforceable, as Jane has mentioned, including in our labor chapters. But from a domestic point of view, we do have some programs and policies that are very important. One is our women's entrepreneurship strategy, and this was established back in 2018 and is a $6 billion investment aimed to increase women-owned businesses' access to financing, talents, networks, and expertise. So this is a very important part of our sort of complementary approach. And for over 20 years now, we have also had our Business Women in International Trade strategy. And what we do with that is, take women business missions, women only and women businesses, to trade fairs and trade missions around the world. And we've been doing that for over 20 years now. And this program, also run out of Global Affairs Canada, has substantial funding to support this work. And through the work of our Chief Economist's Office, which I have noted now a few times because I'm always so impressed with their work, is they have done some deep analysis to show over time the effect these programs are having on the growth of women-owned businesses in Canada and their propensity to export. And the numbers are improving. So, for example, back in I think it was around 2011, only about 5% of Canada's SMEs were owned by women, and now it's around 15%, and now at only about 11% of those of those women-owned businesses export. So we are seeing a growth in this. Hopefully, we're going to have more growth, and we're always collecting and analyzing this data. So I think these programs, sort of work hand in hand with what we're trying to do on the trade policy side, which I think is important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these detailed answers. And I think the conversation can be extended, but we have come to the sort of our intended time or end of the webinar. And so with this, I want to really thank warmly and kindly to our speakers, Georgina and Jane, and to Vanika for helping to organize the webinar. I think it is extremely encouraging to hear that these two sort of approaches in understanding the impacts of policies in trade and other related areas on sort of women and other groups expanding and being applied across different countries, and also being used in capacity building for different groups and stakeholders that need to understand more about these issues. And so we are very happy in ARTNeT to be able to promote both frameworks and other approaches in deepening our understanding of this set of issues, because we have, as you said, Georgina, a number of times, we have only beginning to work on that in a more senior manner, and the work will continue. So thank you very much, and I hope you will join us in future webinars on the topic. We will be trying to update our research community and training community with new advances as they are available. So please follow us on the social media, and we wish you very good rest of the day, good night, and stay safe and healthy. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Mia.
Thank you.
Okay, bye. Bye, Jane.
Bye.
Bye, Vanika.
Bye-bye.
Bye.